So the impetus for this presentation was last year we had a keynote, wonderful keynote speech sort of about women in technology, and it's been a hot topic recently, some books that have been published and other things. So I really wanted to make sure that we kept the conversation going and we didn't just have that one keynote and then never talk about it again. This is a topic that obviously has great interest to me, but hopefully you'll see that it's not just purely selfish interest. You know, from my perspective, it's been something that I've been interested in my whole career, and hopefully today I can share with you some of the things that I've learned, some information that you can go look at on your own as well, so that we can keep the conversation going throughout, you know, Apereo throughout the year, you know, in future conferences. The title is kind of one that I cooked up that I thought might be appealing to people, but I do want to keep some time at the end for conversation, because I think what's really going to be effective coming out of this session is practical advice. I think the keynote that we had last year, if you were able to attend and see it, was very interesting and helpful to introduce a lot of people to the topic, and some of that material is replicated here. But I think the more important thing when I talk to people about these topics is, well, what can I do about it? What's practical stuff that I can actually do about this problem? You know, we are the people on the ground doing the technology day to day. Some of us are in positions where we can make hiring decisions. Some of us are in management positions, and you know, we want practical tips that we can take to actually apply to make things better. I work for a company called Longsight. Some of you are clients of Longsight. It should probably sort of obligatory for me to say that Longsight provides hosting and support and training and development and all that good stuff for Sakai, as well as CAS, which is another Apereo project. But all of our products that we support are open source. We also support Drupal and DSpace and WordPress and some other things as well. They're outside the scope of Apereo. So I just thought I'd put a slide up here just in case anybody was confused about it. There's a lot of research out there that shows that diverse teams are good. They are better, they outperform homogeneous teams. So there's a few references here. I have to apologize. I spent a lot of May gallivanting around Africa, and so didn't have much time as I would have liked to prepare for this presentation. So where I can put references to actual studies or to articles, I've put them. Some places I don't have it because I couldn't find the reference last night when I was putting the slides together. But if you have any questions about anything that's in this presentation, I do have more material that I can share with you. So a variety of different studies say that when teams are diverse, and that's defined in different ways depending on the study, they're better problem solvers, they solve problems quicker, their solutions are better, more stable. What's interesting about it is sometimes, depending on the study, the teams that were mixed in this way rated their own performance worse. They didn't think their solutions were as good, even though empirically they were better than the solutions developed by the teams that were more similar. The teams that were more similar were more confident. They were around all the people that they know and like that are just like them, and so they rated their own performance higher than it actually was. So I think what's interesting about that is, you know, a lot of times in technology we sort of have a shorthand for certain things. We say, oh, well, we'll just throw a bunch of smart people in a room, you know, let's get the brainiest PhDs that we can find, throw them all in a room, and I'm sure whatever they come up with will be great. You know, just don't give them a lot of direction, you know, give them the problem, they can figure it out. And we find that actually studies show that having a bunch of smart people in a group doesn't necessarily make the group smarter. One of the things that I thought was particularly interesting is one of the studies, the MIT CMU Union study that I showed there, was that the more women that a group in their study had, the better that group cooperated. And they have different theories as to why this is so. I didn't make this presentation women in IT. I made a diverse team, so I have some more slides on that as well. But I thought that was an interesting thing to call out. So, you know, you don't know the audience of people who are going to show up. Obviously, you guys have an interest in the topic, or else you wouldn't be here. But I thought it was obligatory to put a thing in there that, you know, yes, this is important. It's something that we should be paying attention to. Not only are diverse teams better problem solvers, but we desperately need anybody that we can get. I'm sure you're all aware that it's really hard to find good, qualified people in IT. That is a problem across the IT community. You can see there's the statistics there. This is from the National Center for Women in Information Technology, but it's also echoed by a good documentary that's out there called She++, which basically states that we don't have enough people to fill these jobs. So a lot of the information that I'm presenting also focuses on the way that we can develop an IT pipeline that's more diverse. You know, right now, if we only have 50% of the people or less, if it's only white males, coming into this development pipeline, coming into these IT tracks, we're missing out on a huge segment of the population that could be helping us out and could be helping us fill this gap. But convincing you that this is the right way to go is not necessarily the goals of this presentation. I'm more focused on, once you're convinced, okay, now what do I do about it? One of the most important things, so the one thing that I really wanted to underscore is, you know, what do I mean by diversity? So we have this description. You could come up with as many different definitions of diversity and what a diverse group looks like as there are people in this world. Most of the information in my presentation has to do with women in general. But I think it's important to note that that's not what diversity is. I'd like this quote from Tina Fey because comedy seems a lot like IT in a lot of ways. You know, my focus is on, you know, bringing some gender equality, but throughout the presentation, a lot of the things that I talk about are equally applicable to bringing in any new people, whether it's a guy who doesn't play Dungeons and Dragons and doesn't fit the stereotype of a traditional developer or IT person, or, you know, a person of color or a woman of color. You know, all of the recommendations that you're going to see later in the slides are just about being more inclusive, bringing more people in no matter what they are. So it's equally applicable to anyone. I would like to have more in this presentation that talks about people of color, but I don't because I ran out of time.
Just want to interrupt real quick.
Sure.
We tonight might have an unofficial RPG, Dungeons and Dragons game in the lobby, just in case anybody's very interested in joining us.
That's not really helpful to my presentation.
Oh, sorry.
I will allow it. No, I mean, well, we'll talk about this more later in the slides, but I think that the Apereo community is a very inclusive community. Although I'm sort of have mixed feelings about the board game activity, but anyway. So anyway, digression. So I mean, the reason I put this slide in here is because I wanted to say that even though a lot of the stuff that I talk about has to do with women in IT, and I am a white woman, so obviously that's my experience. I don't think it's appropriate to have this presentation without at least one slide that says there's more going on here than just that. So, and it's good Scott is here because I didn't show him this before this presentation, so I hope he's okay with it. So one of the things that I want to say in the interest of full disclosure is that my company, Longsight, does not do a great job at this. Although, in some areas, we are outperforming Google. So this is what Google released this week. They've been people have been harping on them for years to release this information, and they've only just now released it this past week. So these are Google's numbers about what kind of representation they have in terms of diversity. And it's pretty much industry standard. The women in tech, the 17% is actually below industry standard. It's closer to 24% across the IT infrastructure. But you know, you can derive some information from this. I think it's interesting that they broke out technical and non-technical roles, that they broke out leadership roles. This is interesting information because Google really sets the standard. I think Google is definitely the kind of organization where they fall prey to the let's just get the smartest guys, let's get all the PhDs, and whatever they do will be amazing. That's definitely been something that's driven their hiring. And I think that's changing from what I can see from the outside, but for a long time that was what drove their hiring. I mean, I remember when they took out a billboard space for like some really obscure problem in major cities in America, and if you could figure out the billboard, then that would lead you to the next clue. And then if you got through this like weird like scavenger hunt of math clues, you would then be able to interview for a position or something. And it's like, is that really the best way to find the most qualified candidate? I guess it depends on what you're hiring for. But, so this is interesting. So, I mean, if we at Longsight don't do as good a job at this as I would like to. And it's, you know, it's something that I think about and I worry about. I think we're doing better, but I think our tech percentage is higher than Google, so that's doing pretty good. It's industry standard, but it could be better. So I don't want to set myself or the company I work up for as on a pedestal here. We could be doing better in this regard too. And we're terrible in terms of people of color. To my knowledge, although it's not something we talk about at the company, we have no people of color. But I think it's important to say that Apereo is, at least in my personal opinion, and this is subjective, Apereo does outperform other technical communities that I'm involved with. You know, when I went to Google I/O, this is the only time in my life I've never had to wait to use the bathroom at like a 3,000 person conference. I just went right in, and there was a line for the men's bathroom, and that never happens. So that was kind of good, actually. But you know, I mean, how many technical conferences do you go to? And it's like, all dudes. You know, it's an interesting network opportunity because, you know, sometimes I'll go to a conference and I'll find the one other girl that's there, and I say, oh, well, we should talk because you're the only other girl that's here. So it's a nice, like, opening line. But, you know, Apereo and before that, SAPAC community has always done a really good job of listening, of, you know, trying to be representative, and I think that comes from the fact that we come from an educational technology environment. You know, it's not just about the core technology, it's about education, it's about instructors, it's about teaching and learning, it's about librarians, it's about students, and so because we already have that inclusive message, and then you look at the keynote this morning, we're trying to be an international community, that's already put us on the path of being a more inclusive community. I mean, I read a lot in this area, and you hear a lot of horror stories about things that happen to people at conferences. I didn't put it into the presentation, but some really bad stuff. And that would never happen here because we are a smaller conference, but also because we have this inclusive message. So, you know, I think the takeaway is we're doing good, but we can always be doing better as a community. So, you know, I have a couple slides out here on understanding the challenges. Obviously, nobody would be here if they didn't care about this topic. I think it's interesting if you did not come, but that's a discussion for another time. And we have to understand and internalize, whether we're men or women, what are the challenges? Because sometimes we don't pay enough attention to that. Hiring in IT is notoriously difficult, and we're all bad at it. I don't know anyone who does a good job. Google was infamous for doing these tests that they made people take, you know, all these weird questions that you had to solve in order to pass their hiring, to the point where they even published books about it, you know, how to crack the code of these weird questions that you get in interviews. And they've been doing it for years, and then recently they just did a huge longitudinal study about this process, and Google came out and said, yeah, so that stuff we were doing, it doesn't work at all. It's a terrible way to pick the people that you hire. So if Google doesn't even know what they're doing, how can the rest of us do any better? So, you know, for me, it's more about understanding what are the challenges, you know, implicit challenges, things that we're even unconscious about. So this is a great short little article, which I highly recommend. It's just a synopsis of a study. You can find it in the New York Times. But I wanted to reproduce the entire article here because everything in it is a gem, and it's not very long. But I mean, the takeaway here is that the people who were doing the hiring, whether they were men or women, had a preference to hire males. And even when they were given hard data about the applicant's ability to do the tasks they were hiring for, they still were more likely to choose a man. So, and that doesn't matter the sex of the person who's doing the hiring. So that's something we need to be aware of. All the stuff that I'm going to present to you under understanding challenges is to say, like, we should be keeping this in our minds at all times. As anything that we're doing, you know, why am I making this decision? If I'm in a leadership role, why am I picking this person? Why am I selecting this person to talk? Why am I asking this person their opinion? Why am I putting this person in charge of the project? My perception is this person is a superstar and this person is not. Why is that perception? The goal for the manager is to always be asking ourselves these questions through the lens of some of these challenges that we're aware of. Academics are not immune to this. This was in a sort of traditional business environment. In academia, we're not immune to this. There's a great study, it's the John Jennifer study. So basically what they did is they took a CV for a potential lab research assistant position, and the CV was exactly the same. The only thing that was different was the first name of the candidate. This is a study that's been repeated a lot. And in academia, they found the same results. Which was that the folks in charge of picking the lab assistant were more likely to pick them. There's also some interesting other things in the study about their perceptions of how the women these potential applicants were perceived. The women were judged more harshly when they made claims about things that they had done. So it's kind of interesting too. And I'll throw in a personal anecdote because I think it's interesting. You know, I've been really lucky. I've had a lot of great female mentors. You know, but so a lot of my, you know, early career, I didn't really pay attention to any of this, but there have been moments where things have stood out to me and I thought they were really interesting. So when I was leaving NYU, which is where I worked before I was alongside, We were hiring a bunch of different positions, and we needed to hire somebody to fulfill a Blackboard position. It's a junior position, not necessarily a development position, but a technical role. And we had a lot of trouble finding the right person. And we looked at tons of resumes, and it was really hard to find somebody who even had anything that was going to be applicable. So we brought in 2 particular candidates. They didn't really have great experience with what we were looking for with Blackboard specifically, but they had something enough to bring them in. And I thought, in my mind, they were very equal candidates. They were about the same place in their careers. They had the same amount of expertise. But it's interesting, you know, we knew that they wouldn't just work on Blackboard. There were other things going on at the time in the different projects. So, you know, we were looking at other skills that they had as well. And so the guy had PHP on his list of skills, and the girl did not. And in the interviews, I asked both of them the same question, which is, you know, what's your comfort level with PHP? What's your experience with it? And I asked the girl too, even though she didn't have it on her resume. And the guy said, well, you know, I don't know a ton about PHP, but I played around with it. I've done a few little things with it, so I could probably figure it out. And when I asked the girl about it, even though it wasn't on her resume, she said, oh, well, you know, I don't really know that much about it. I've done a few little things with it, and I could probably figure it out, but I don't really know that much about it. Their answers were exactly the same. Their experience was exactly the same. And only because I asked about it did I even know that she had worked with it. She didn't put it on her resume, and I was like, why wouldn't you? And that was like such a stark contrast because they were so similar in so many respects. At the end of the day, we didn't hire either of them, but for different reasons. But, you know, I thought it was a really interesting, we found a more qualified internal. You know, this is the one example I have that talks about people of color. This hiring name example, where you take the same resume but you give it different names. They've also replicated these studies with, I hate to use this word, but urban or Africanized names. So, you know, when they put a white person's name or a black person's name on the resume, even if it's the same, people choose the white person. So that's another interesting bias that we have to, you know, think about. You know, in a slightly different twist on the study, Leanin talks about a Harvard Business School study where they had a little bio about a successful venture capitalist. It's the Howard Heidi study. So in this case, they did the same thing. The venture capitalist was either Howard or Heidi, but the description of sort of how this venture capitalist had become successful was the same. And students found Howard more likable and seemed like somebody that they wanted to work with. Or would hire, whereas Heidi seemed selfish and not the type of person you would want to hire work for. And let's be clear, the bios were exactly the same. So that's an interesting thing to think about. And there's a whole other thing in Leanin about likability and how that affects women, which we can go into if you guys are interested. Gina Davis, yes, the actress, she funds an institute on gender and media, and she wrote an interesting article for Variety recently about one of the findings of her institute, which was that in the study, men perceived a 17% ratio as being 50-50, which means that they looked into a crowd that was composed of 17% women and the rest men, and they looked at that and thought that looked like 50-50% men and women. So, you know, and her interest in that is representation of women in media, but I think it's also important when we talk about building teams. You know, one of the Etsy case study that I'll show in a second, one of the findings from that case study was they found that, and this is a depressing statistic, but this is what they found, which is that the teams that they had at Etsy worked better when there were either no women on the team or more than one woman on the team. When the team only had one woman on it, then she was the woman on the team and it didn't work. So, you know, I think when you're thinking about building teams and their composition, these are things to keep in mind. The McKinsey study reference is kind of similar to the takeaway from the previous slide, and I think this is especially applicable when assessing IT potential and sort of hiring and promotion in IT, which was that the study showed that men were promoted based on potential while women were promoted based on accomplishments. So there's this idea that you could see potential in a candidate. Even if they didn't know something, you could tell that they could learn it or they could do it. And women don't get that benefit of the doubt. So I think that's something that we should keep in mind when we're looking at candidates for leadership, candidates for leading teams. That's something we have to keep in mind. And Sheryl Sandberg, before she published Lean In, she gave a TED Talk about a lot of those topics. And one of the anecdotes that she tells from the TED Talk I thought was really interesting, which is that she was doing an internal presentation at Facebook on this topic of women. And she said at the end of her presentation, she took some questions from the audience, and then she said, okay, you know, time is running late. I can only take 2 more questions. And so there were 2 questions. And then one of the female participants of the presentation came up and told her later and said, you know, I had a question. but you said you were only going to take 2 more questions. So after you took those 2 questions, I put my hand down. And then you took 3 more questions. So she was like, so I learned I have to keep my hand up. Even if you say, I'm only taking 2 more questions, I still have to keep my hand up. And Cheryl Sandberg was like, because she's like, if I can't even like be aware of that when it's me and I'm doing a presentation about this topic, then we have a problem. So I think it's an interesting example. If you're in a leadership position and you're setting the standard, understand that not everybody's going to interpret the guidelines that you provide in the same way. There's another author, Clay Shirky, who's a professor at NYU. He wrote an article about the program that he's in at NYU is very sort of portfolio-based, and the students really have to take a lot of initiative on their own. And he said, the ladies in the program don't come to me. They don't press me. Like if I say this is the deadline, they don't push back. They don't ask for more time. They take the guidelines as hard rules, whereas the men that I advise, they're like guidelines, So, and again, anything that we talk about that is a, generalization is just that, a generalization. I should have said that at the beginning, but. So, some more challenges, and these are usually referenced in a lot of the literature that you'll read online about this, so confidence gap and imposter syndrome. Both of these things can affect anybody, but we disproportionately see them in STEM industries for women. So, when girls are told before a test that girls are bad at math, or even if they have to check a box that says, male, female before they take the test, they do worse on the test. There's some kind of societal thing that's happening in their brains. And also studies, and this, I don't have a reference for this, but I can get one if you want. Studies show that, what do folks attribute their success to? And for girls in math, they attribute it to luck or help rather than innate talent. And it's interesting because we don't see this result in other subjects that they learn, only in math and science. The imposter syndrome is rampant, and this is definitely something that can happen to anyone in any industry, but it's something that I'm especially aware of. We can't, when folks have a feeling like they're a fraud and they're going to be discovered, and the fact that they don't really know anything is going to be unveiled to the masses, you have to look at what's fueling that, what's feeding that feeling. Obviously you can't control people's feelings, but what is it about the environment that we're creating, that we're fostering, that's fueling that and making people step away from those careers and from those roles that we desperately need them in. So that sort of ties into what's your work environment like. Obviously it goes without saying that any weird sexual harassment thing is not something you want to have in your environment. I think we all already know that. I think that's obvious. If you walk into some kind of, machine shop and there's a sexy bikini lady poster on the wall, it's not going to really make that environment really welcoming to women. We already know that. That's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about, especially in the case of the work environment, what is the environment like? What are the messages that you're sending people? Is this a space for them? If I walk into a room and I see a lot of signs that say, this is not for you, 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 and I'm going to think, maybe this isn't for me. I'm going to walk away because it's not for me. So there's no explicit takeaway here, but it's about what kind of messages are you sending out about who is the right person to be in this space. And if you're constantly sending out a message that it's this one type of person, then it's going to make the other people who try to join that space either feel like a fraud or leave. We see a lot of times this concept that's coming up in Silicon Valley of culture fit. So, I put a quote in there about it, which is, when you're doing hiring, how do you assess these candidates? We've already talked about how those tests don't work. In the SC case study, you'll see some examples of some other things that we do that don't work. But, sometimes we say, well, that person isn't really a good culture fit for us. They don't match with our Dungeons and Dragons playing culture. I don't know. So, but I think the thing that we have to worry about as managers is, just because somebody is not exactly like everybody else in the team, that's not a good enough reason to send them packing or to say that you don't work. If we, as managers and as IT professionals, cannot figure out a way to work with people who are not exactly like us, we're not going to go very far. It's not a good enough reason to turn someone away. And if you are a manager in a situation where there's somebody there who's not, there's some kind of frisbee, there's some kind of friction, where they're not fitting in, don't just say, Probably have to let that person go. Or maybe we'll just alienate them enough so they quit on their own, which is a strategy that I've seen a lot of people use, which I think is the most immature, like infantile way to get somebody out of your company possible, or organization. So, confront the issue head on. What's really going on here? Is this person just a toxic personality, or is there something bigger going on here? Are the issues that they're raising legitimate? Can you find a way to work with them that gets all the talent that they have while minimizing any kind of friction? So there's a show that comes on after Game of Thrones called Silicon Valley, and the first 3 episodes that I watched threw me into complete rage, and I went on Facebook and typed a million rage tweets or rage Facebook postings, and my husband was like, "This is just a comedy show. Why are you getting so upset?" This comic, which I took a really bad snapshot with my phone with, is from Pendo Quarterly, which is a print publication from Pendo Daily, and it kind of encapsulates what I feel about why the show pisses me off so much, because there's really no women in it. And, it's about alienation. It speaks back to that, like, this is not for you concept. If folks look out in the media and they see these careers represented, but everything about the way those careers are represented says, this is not for you, this is not for you, this is not for you, they're going to think, this is not for me. And so the women are there, they're just not being represented. So if you're trying to increase the proportion of women or people of color, don't have every single message that you send out about that career be, there's none of those people here. So some case studies. So Etsy, if you're familiar with it, is like the eBay of handicrafts. They're based in New York, not too far away from where I used to live. And it's mentioned in the actual link here, but one problem that they had, and that I even noticed when I went there to visit, which is that they had a real sort of dichotomy between the different people who worked for the company. They had their male engineers over on one side of the building, and then they had all the women who worked for the company on the other side of the building. And there was, they recognized that this was a problem, especially considering like 99% of their users are women. And they were saying, it's not just because you work on the, for them it was important to have more women working on the code base because their customers were women, even though that's not a one-to-one correlation that's important to them. But it made them more aware of it than I think another company might be. So how could they increase, the software developers at that company? So the biggest thing that they did was they invested in what they call their hacker school. So every summer they have basically a programming school, and people apply, and there are scholarships and different ways that you can get in. And what's amazing about the hacker school is not just to teach skills, but it's actually an extended interview. So, one of the things that they said about interviews and why they suck, to use their terminology, is, a lot of these interviews are, okay, quick, prove to me how smart you are. And that speaks to sort of the Google example. When really, that's not what you're trying to measure at all. So what is the point of that experience? And how many people are you turning away because they don't like that confrontational style and it makes them shut down? So, the hacker school became, one of the side benefits of it was that it was a great extended interview where they could actually see how these people solve problems, how they worked, in a non-confrontational, realistic problem-solving environment. And some of the people who did the hacker school went on to do other things. It wasn't just women at the hacker school, it was all different kinds of people. That was important to them too. And the takeaway for them was simply saying that you value diversity isn't enough. If people, again, it speaks to that this is not for you concept. If you come in and all you see is dudes, you can have a million white papers about diversity, but if you don't see it represented, you're not going to believe it. And so the hacker school worked really well. At the time of the writing of the presentation that they put together, they had 33% developers were women. They did not talk in this presentation about diversity at all, like about people of color. So we don't know. I do have other problems with this presentation. When you look, it's actually a video, and when you watch the presentation, it's at one of these hoity-toity, like, entrepreneurial, like, Masters of the Universe kind of conferences, and all the people in the audience are white dudes. So it's like, well, it's great that you're presenting on this, but it speaks to your point, which is if it's all one kind of person in the audience, then I don't really believe you. So, I like what they tried to do, but I think they could do better. But I think what's nice about this case study is it's a practical example of something tangible they actually did that had a measurable improvement that they could see. So Harvey Mudd is a very prestigious college, part of the Claremont Colleges in California. It's the best little school that you've never heard of, which is sort of their unofficial motto. And one of the things that they have, they now have a female provost, president, whatever. And so she's an engineer by trade and a doctor, and she wanted to increase the percentage of women because she saw it was dropping off at Harvard Mud. It was actually going down, and she was worried about that. So they did a lot of different things. One of the things that they did, they wrote a whole paper about it, which you can read. One of the most important things they did was that they completely overhauled their intro to programming course. So the problem was that even though women were showing up to take the classes and interested in the major, once they took the first course, they dropped out. And it sort of speaks to this macho, prove to me what you know mentality, which was that the original course, intro course, was sort of a hardcore, like crash course, like 50% of this people will drop out of this course kind of course. And that was turning a lot of people off, not just women. And it was like, well, what is the point of having this course be so hard? Like, we need more programmers. This is not about, only the strongest survive. We need as many programmers as we can get. So they completely overhauled it, and they changed from Java to Python because they felt it was more, sort of intuitive to beginners. And then one of the problems that you see over and over again is that a lot of white males that come to computer science for an undergraduate degree already have many, many years of programming experience. So they started when they were like 12. Is that necessary to be a good programmer? No, not at all. But it definitely makes other people, when they show up with no experience, feel like they're already behind. So they changed it so that now the intro, you can either take the gold or the black intro course. And gold is no prior programming experience, and black is I have programming experience already. But both are equally satisfied a requirement. And other universities are now starting to adopt this gold-black curriculum. And they changed from raw, just pure computational problems to actually problem-solving problems. So actual examples of programs across scientific discipline where they could actually use the skills they were learning to solve those problems. They also, that was the main thing. They also did two other things. They provided sponsorship to the Grace Hopper Conference. So one of the problems that we often see is that there's this concept of the unicorn. So a lot of companies will have one technical woman who works for them, and she's the one technical woman. And it's like, well, what happens if you want to add a second technical woman? How does that second person feel? How does the first person feel about the second person? Now you're setting up this something weird is happening here now. And it's creating a tension that doesn't need to be there. So one thing that's really important is to have peers and mentors that you can identify with. If you look around and you don't see anyone else like you, it's going to be really hard for you to maintain yourself in that career, in that program. So the Grace Hopper Conference is put on by the Anita Borg Institute. It's all about women in technology. So by traveling to this conference, their students could form those connections and get that mentorship, even if they couldn't get it where they were. And then they also developed a new hands-on research project program for their sophomores. Their rising sophomores could now contribute to real practical research projects and get their names involved in published papers. And that was obviously a huge bonus and benefit to all of the students in the program, not just the girls, but it helped retain them in the major. So you can read, but those were the three main takeaways from that study. Obviously, in both of these case studies, you might be thinking, well, how does this apply to me? I think one of the main benefits that we have in educational technology is we have a pipeline right there of students coming out of computer science and science programs, right there in our own universities. We need to tap that pipeline as much as possible. And I think the takeaway is, even if somebody's not coming from the computer science program, maybe they're coming from biology, maybe they're coming from something completely different, recognize the potential that's there and train them up. The hacker school example is a perfect example of that. The folks who came into that hacker school didn't necessarily have any prior programming experience, but they had the intellect and the will to learn. And if you talk about hiring folks who have hiring responsibilities in IT, they'll often say, it actually doesn't matter if they know the exact technology that we're trying to hire for right now. If I know that they can learn it, if I know they're good problem solvers, if I know they're dependable, all these other sort of more intangible skill sets, then they'll be perfect. And so the hacker school gave them a good way to measure that. But if we could measure that better, then actually the skills that they know is not so important anymore. We can judge them on the potential rather than the knowledge of specific things. I know I'm running out of time. So another thing you can do, you're going to have to do some recruitment. So this example is from speaking at conferences. It's really difficult to get women to speak at conferences. Obviously, Apereo is doing a lot better because we've had a lot of women keynote speakers. But again and again, conference organizers say it's really hard to find women to speak at technical conferences. You can speculate with your own reasons as to why, but one of the things that does help is going out and actually recruiting those speakers. So how is this applicable to us? You know, if you're going to have to go out and look for those promising candidates. They're not necessarily going to come to you. I mean, one of the things that I often hear is people say, like, look, I'm not going to hire an unqualified candidate, which obviously you shouldn't do. But, you know, all the resumes that I get is this. You know, I can only pick from the resumes that I get. And it's like, well, how are you getting those resumes? Are you just calling your recruiting agency and saying, send me some resumes? Or are you going out? Are you going to the students in your computer science programs? Are you going to the students in your other STEM programs at your university? Are you going out to the places where the other people will be and promoting your postings? You know, Anita Borg and National Center for Women Computing, with NITWIT is the unfortunate acronym, they have job posting boards too. So you can go to those places and, you know, put your posting out there. But it's going to require a little bit more effort, but it's not that crazy. It's doable. I mean, and talking specifically about the conference speaking example, there's a reason why I always speak at the Apereo conference every year. It's important to me to walk the talk, to do it myself and to show people that it can be done. I know several women in the Apereo community who I think should be giving presentations and are not, because it's not their personality. So all I can do, aside from encouraging them, is do my own thing and then hope other people will too. But that point at the end is recognize when challenges are preventing you from seeing a qualified candidate. So, you know, that goes to what I was speaking about before, which is, are we just looking, are you evaluating a candidate for either a position or for some kind of promotion or leadership position based on do they have XYZ skills, or are you actually looking at the total package? What's really important to you? What does this person really need to know how to do? Because I think, you know, there's a lot of job postings out there that say, oh, you should have a master's in computer science. And it's like, well, what do you actually learn when you do a master's in computer science? And are those skills actually what I need? You know, if my whole app is written in Python, just because they have a master's in computer science, we're making this sort of false equivalence where they're like, okay, well, if they don't know Python, but they have a master's in computer science and my thing's in Python, I'm sure they could probably figure it out. And it's like, okay, well, but you're going about this sort of not quite the most direct manner. Okay, so another thing that we have to remember, it needs to be okay for women to fail. This is from a slightly controversial article called I Need Terrible Female Engineers. And I think the takeaway, the clarification that's at the bottom of the article is, I'm not saying hire bad people. That's not the point. The point is that when we have this sort of environment where you constantly need to be proving yourselves. And when we talk about Apereo, this is an open source community. Everything you do is out in the open. You file a JIRA, you comment on a JIRA, you commit some source code. Everybody can see it. So it has to be okay for you to make a mistake. Because if you are afraid to make a mistake because you're the one woman at your company, and if you make a mistake, then there's some kind of false equivalence that's happening here, then you don't contribute at all because you're too afraid of what might happen. And, you know, maybe the whole STEM system is just out of order. You know, we need to rethink the way that we do business in the US. We don't provide a lot of support to our employees. We do some. Universities are traditionally doing this a lot better than probably a lot of corporations are. That's probably why you see a higher proportion of women in IT in higher ed when you compare against other other companies and stuff out there in the public sector. In the private sector. But, you know, think about who you value at your organization. You know, a lot of times you talk about, oh, well, this guy's a superstar, this gal's a superstar, this guy's just like super brilliant, he has a PhD, and he just, when he talks, I have no idea what he's saying. And it's like, well, that's not really helpful. I don't mean to demean those folks. We have some really brilliant people here at the Apereo conference, and they are truly brilliant. But the ones who are the most effective are the ones who can articulate their brilliance, the ones who mentor, the ones who can bring everybody along with them. And what kind of environment do you want to support, and who do you value? And then I just put some other thoughts on here because I needed another slide. I felt like I needed another slide. You know, we talked about the soft skills. I hate that, soft skills. But communication and all those other soft skills are really crucial. And don't count them as secondary. In a lot of cases, sometimes they need to be primary. You know, understand, and this is true, this is a message that women need to internalize as well. You're not the mom of the team. You know, these developers are big boys. They can, you know, take their own notes and they can do their own expense reports. And, you know, my thing is all about putting it back on them. You know, you can do this. You don't need me to do this for you. We always have to be asking ourselves and taking the temperature of what we're doing. You know, going back over all these things that we've talked about, what, you know, could I be doing better? Is there some kind of bias in myself that I'm, you know, exercising when I choose this person over that person? What are the real reasons for the choice that I'm making when I'm giving someone a leadership position, or I'm giving someone a responsibility, or I'm saying this person is, you know, needs help, they're falling behind, or I don't know, they're on the rocks. Why are they on the rocks? What's going on? And then that's the other point I made before about don't confuse experience and ability. Ability, I find in the technical space, is actually more important than experience in a lot of cases. Not all. I mean, it just depends on the circumstance. But something to keep in mind. I think that's, oh yeah, one more slide. Oops. So, you know, taking it back to Apereo, and I mentioned this a little bit already, which is that we are an open source community. So all this stuff is out in the open. So that creates a sort of barrier to entry for a lot of people. Although I do put except when it's not, because one thing that irritates me is that there are private lists that people have discussions on that are not open to the public, that nobody knows about, and I think that that sort of leads to sort of like a star chamber, like secret cabal decision-making process that I don't really like. But anyway, this is a little bit of a digression. We're focused on educational technology, as I said before. We have this connection to universities, so we have this pipeline of talent that we could be bringing in that we can look to for new hires. And also that provides us with another reason for widening the discussion. So this is not a purely technical conference. We always want to bring in librarians and educators and all different kinds of people, and that gives us the ability to sort of not be constrained by thinking there's only one type of person that can contribute. So we're already light years ahead of a lot of other communities. I do think we need to be a lot better about bringing in new developers. You know, this is like a huge problem in the Sakai community right now. You know, up until this conference, every year I would do a presentation that was about like intro to like Sakai development. There's also the boot camp, but that's like a whole day long affair that people don't necessarily know about until they get here, especially if they're new. So we need to be better about this process of bringing new people into development pool, because it's really intimidating, because there's a lot of information and it's really hard to get started. So that's something that I want to see us do better at. And I think I'm exactly out of time. But if anybody wants to stay and raise anything or talk about anything, that's I'm more than open to it. But that's everything I have.
One quick comment.